Thanks, Evan, for the introduction. So just to give a little background why I'm here, I was one of Doug's graduate students kind of at the same time as Savio and Andrea, kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was really a blessing and it was a great opportunity. I don't even know if I realized it when I was there to work with Doug, the breadth and depth of his knowledge and his and work in the industry. Kind of as a grad student, you're just getting started. You don't realize that what you're getting into or what you're being exposed to, and you think that's just normal. But after I got out there, you could see that I was really given a special opportunity, and I got very lucky to do my work with Doug. And I know I definitely was exposed and I was able to look at a lot of different situations, a lot of different topics. I looked at corrosion, testing, chloride ingress, and service life modeling, and that kind of became my interest. I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I've been doing recently on service life modeling, some of the things I've been thinking about, but a lot of that was inspired, and the concepts were inspired by some of the work I did with Doug. I do want to acknowledge very briefly my co-authors of this presentation, Ali and Safe and Neil Burke, who work with me at Tourney Consulting. So what I want to talk about is service life modeling, particularly for new structures. There's even more and more of a focus on durability and making sure they last a long, long time. A lot of more specifications we're seeing, they'll have 100 or 125 or 150 year life that they want demonstrated by service life modeling, and they become more and more part of the design considerations. And as you can see in the industry, there's a few references that are coming out there that didn't exist 20 years ago. FIB model up in Europe, they were over in Europe, 2006 was one of the first ones. But really relatively recently, 2020 and 2025, we're getting some more design specifications out there, and they've able to be used to kind of allow this to become part of the standard or not so standard design practice. One of the things that they do think about, unlike structural design where you just have factors of safety but you're basically doing everything deterministically, service life modeling tends to explicitly look at the probabilistic evaluation. And you need to directly account for the variability of all these properties you have. And it's not just the materials properties, but it's also the environmental properties, and you have to account for them together. And that's really what's looking at the right level of uncertainty or level of reliability becomes equivalent to your safety factors in structural design. And often probabilistic analysis becomes important, where you use your Monte Carlo analysis or some other statistical techniques. Accepted probability of failure, though, tends to be much higher than it is for structural analysis. We're usually typically at a 10% or like a 90% reliability or 95% reliability, depending upon the structure. And often what it comes down to is whether it can be easily inspected or not. And the reason why it's lower is you get this trade-off between performance and cost. We could make it 1 in 1,000 chance, but then you're paying a lot more money on that. So given the impact of long service life design, it doesn't make it unsafe, just means you may need to fix it a little bit sooner. These kind of where in the industry where we're heading now is that kind of reliability much lower than safety, because it really is a serviceability concern. So what I did for the study is looked at chloride-reduced corrosion, used Life 365 model, which was developed at the University of Toronto while I was there, and I'm sure Doug wasn't the direct author, but he had certainly a lot of influence on what it was doing. It's primarily an initiation model, so it looks when the chlorides get to the level of steel. There's a few tweaks to it. It looks at time dependence of the diffusion value, probabilistic analysis. But really, I was just using this as a model to kind of try to demonstrate what would be the impact of variability. Is this the right model? It's the only model that's out there? No, there's other ones. The same concepts still would apply. So to kind of, as a demonstration, I I use two different types of concretes, pulling the parameters. There's typical ones you may or may see in a structure. Looked at 3 inches of cover, urban bridges, and you can see those two different mixed designs. You put that all into Life 365 at a deterministic level, so that's using the average values. You get about 30 years for mix 1, and then the higher quality mix, it predicts 203.1 years. Whether that's accurate or not, I would say, but again, this is just for demonstration purposes. But then when you bring it down to a 10% probability, just using the default variability values from Life 365, that rings down to about 40 or 45 or 35% of what the probabilistic or the deterministic, the average structure would be. You're down to 30 years you're predicting for design purposes for mix 1, and 71 years for mix 2. So that really does a significant impact on what your predicted service life would mean, which conversely we converted to what the effect of what mix you need to provide to get what you're trying to demonstrate to fulfill your contractual requirements. But that obviously, so my big takeaway about this is really need to understand what your variability is going to be, so you can properly account for that in your prediction model, so you're not at one side over penalizing yourself because you expect it to be a higher variability, but at the same time capturing what would be out there. So you don't want, you want to get the right values. And I respect what they did way back when they became Life 365 available, but I know best guesses at the time, we need to look at them and are they actually accurate or not. So Life 360, so I looked at 3 different parameters that really are important for service life. The surface concentration, the concrete cover, and the diffusion value. So exposure property, a materials property, and a geometric property, how it's constructed, but what impact they would have on your predicted life. We do operate Tourney. Part of what Tourney is a lab. We have gone back to, so we do extract cores and we profile cores. So we went back to our database, so we dug out a few examples where we've done multiple cores from the same structure, and we kind of looked at what we were getting and what's the coefficient of variation there and how good was the guesses when that was put together. So for surface concentration, first one, it was really all the same structure, or it's the same project, but it's multiple structures. It's a fairly long bridge system, and we looked, and there were multiple samples taken from basically each span that allowed us to get a coefficient of variation, or get different diffusion values and coefficient of variations for each span. And we found that the coefficient of variation ranged from 17% to 60% when we looked at, for this de-icing exposure, this one project, what the different values seemed to give us. But if you average them all together, we got 33%, which was like, yeah, that's pretty good. I don't know if they got lucky or they were good, whichever way it is, but that's a pretty reasonable, 30% seems to be a pretty reasonable exam. So not a bad start for this thing, but obviously it can vary much more significantly, and this is for de-icing exposures. We also pulled marine structures, however, where we've looking at it's primarily piers and wharfs. We've had a number of projects where we've extracted cores from different elevations, different exposure zones, atmospheric zone, basically the top of the deck, and then the splash, tidal, and submerged zones, different locations within the piers, within the piles. Couple of different things. First of all, not quite as accurate, 33%, though maybe looking at overall, it's not too bad. But the one thing I found more interesting was it was higher for the atmospheric zone, and then as you went more and more consistent immersion in the water, your coefficient of variation for the surface concentration decreased. So that may be something that we should think about, is like, look, for these areas that are in the splash, tidal, or submerged zone in a marine concrete, maybe we can reduce the variability, and that would have a beneficial effect on, we don't need to over-design the mix as much. Second one we looked at, the diffusion value. Life 365 was 25% as the default. We looked at, again, these are a number of it's the same, nominally the same mixture, but from different batches and different locations. I think this is from that same first project where we looked at different spans, and we looked at what the coefficient of variation of the multiple tests within that spans. They generally ranged from 11 to 84%, but there's really that one outlier that's 11%. They seem to do a good job. Most of them were in the 60 to 80 kind of range, which is an average of 72%. So at least based on this, and this is a historic structure, may not have had the same quality control as it is nowadays, but we're drastically underestimating the coefficient of variation of the diffusion value of these tests from this data. But I think one of the things we're trying to do is keep mining our data and looking at, well, if we've done multiple tests of a current, a newer structure that's not 75 years old, where is it at, and does it have is it a tighter value? Oh yeah, so that's what this is. I forgot I had this in here. This was one where we actually went to 1556, where these are existing structures. They're not as old, and we were able to get uncontaminated samples. We took the bottom samples, so we actually were able to run the 1556, which got rid of that whole some of the other variability from exposure conditions, and we can see that the value dropped to about 47%, so a lot better, and anything helps. But again, it is a whole construction project, so how it varies along the construction, but you can see it's still fairly high, but more than we were anticipating way back when Life 365 was put together. Cover was the third one we looked at. We kind of look at it two ways. The first one is the tolerance from ACI 117 is basically, it's a little more complicated. You have a half inch of tolerance. So we consider, well, if a half inch of tolerance, 95% of the bars should be within that half inch. So half of that half inches will be your standard deviation. So you get a coefficient of variation that's a function of your cover. The bar moves the same amount, but your cover's more, so the coefficient of variation is less. Nice thing about that, for a 3-inch cover, which is the one I happen to pick, 8%. And I don't know where the Life 365 default, they may have went through that whole thing, or they may be lucky or good. But for 8%, it was the default value. So from a different way of looking at it theoretically, we should be considering the cover, this coefficient of variation as a function of the cover, but the default value is not too bad. But we then found another structure. This one is more of a parking garage inside of a building, so that could have an influence on it. And we'd done a whole bunch of measurements. Cover in one direction was 1.5 inches, 2 inches in another direction. So we looked at each bay and calculated what the coefficient of variation is, and that's what the bar graph is on the left. But the average value, if we looked at both directions, it was 13%, ranged between 28 and 8. If you looked at, and it didn't really change much if we just looked at it in one direction or the other. But still, it's higher than 8%, but considering that the cover is less, it's probably it really follows that pretty well. So last thing, just to kind of get a feel, like, what do we really care? I ran the same two mixes different exposures, coefficient of variations, and adjusted the variability. The first line is what I've shown you before, and then the bottom four are all the different scenarios. And you can see it does have an impact on what that ratio is between the 10% versus the mean value. But again, we're all in that 30, that we're really looking at around 30, 35% of what you're doing. So you really need to increase your performance by 3 times to when you start looking at it probabilistically. So that's what I did to kind of been thinking about recently. That we really need to look at the variability and trying to tie them down, and that's before we can use them as part of a specifications, as a way to figure out really what's going on. And ideally it should be from project-specific testing. The Life 365 values are not too bad if you don't know anything else, but particularly the diffusion value probably should be increased a little bit. So thank you for listening, and I know we're probably over time, but we're good. I don't know if you have any questions, so thanks.